Good day, everyone. The world is shifting faster than Western leaders can explain, and the louder they shout, the more obvious their fear becomes. We are now witnessing the collapse of illusions, illusions about power, about alliances, and about who actually controls the fate of Europe. For nearly 4 years, the war in Ukraine has dominated headlines. But behind the dramatic speeches and carefully staged press conferences lies a very different reality. Russia is not losing. Russia is not collapsing. Russia is in control. Today, I want to strip away the propaganda and look at what is really driving the panic in Washington and Brussels, the facts on the battlefield, the corruption scandals tearing Kyiv apart, the chaos inside the European Union, and the diplomatic theater that gets more absurd by the day, because once you understand the truth, everything the West is doing right now, every threat, every escalation, every desperate headline suddenly makes perfect sense. Let's dive in. Have you ever noticed how Western politicians twist themselves into knots trying to justify their own failures? Just last week, they were ranting about how Russia must shrink its army so that Estonia can sleep peacefully at night, and now they pretend Ukraine's military, which they present as some innocent actor that has never invaded anyone, is the noble victim, while Russia is supposedly the great threat to everyone. They ignore their own role in creating this mess while lecturing others about stability and security. That posture tells you everything about where we really are in this conflict. The West is panicking, Ukraine is collapsing, and Russia quietly holds the strategic upper hand. Take the recent Florida negotiations. The United States staged a meeting with Ukrainian officials in what was sold as another step toward peace, but in reality, it was pure theater. Washington is the architect and main sponsor of this proxy war, yet it plays the self-appointed role of neutral mediator. The main Ukrainian negotiator was Umarov, while Budanov, who was rumored to lead the delegation, appears to have been parked somewhere in a three-letter agency office rather than at the table. Even Umarov himself is implicated in the same corruption scandal that brought down Yermak, yet this is the figure the West treats as a credible representative of a functioning state. On the other side sat Witkoff, Rubio, and Jared Kushner, as if bringing in a Trump family insider magically gives these talks legitimacy. Rubio dutifully intoned the usual cliches about ending the conflict, safeguarding Ukraine's sovereignty, and ensuring its future prosperity once this is all wrapped up. In reality, the purpose is not peace, but optics. Maintain the illusion that Ukraine still has agency and that the West is heroically trying to save it. The Ukrainian side came with demands that revealed just how detached from reality they remain. They insisted on retaining NATO membership in their constitution and refused any commitment to abandon it. The excuse was that NATO membership is enshrined in the Constitution and therefore untouchable, as if that document were some ancient sacred scroll rather than a modern political instrument that can be amended as easily as it was altered a few years ago to add this clause. The same people who rewrote the Constitution to lock in NATO aspirations now claim their own amendment is irreversible. They also refused to agree to withdraw troops from Donbass and insisted on a ceasefire along current contact lines, as though they were negotiating from a position of strength, when in fact the Russian military has steadily pushed them back and ground down their forces. Despite all this, Witkoff and Kushner now head to Moscow to present what exactly an empty package with no concessions and no coherent plan. Russia will listen courteously because Moscow understands the value of appearing reasonable. But it is Russia, not Washington or Kyiv, that controls the military and strategic tempo of this war. In parallel, the information warfare front has been busy. The Telegraph published an opinion piece allegedly authored by Valery Zaluzhny, the former commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, who is now the ambassador to the UK. Anyone with basic sense can see it was written by British intelligence operatives and stamped with Zaluzhny's name. The article's essence is simple. Ukraine needs a pause or peace that is not real peace at all, but a freeze to regroup, rearm, and then resume the conflict later in a stronger position in order to finally defeat Putin. Under the guise of security guarantees, the peace floats ideas such as placing nuclear weapons in Ukraine or stationing large NATO forces on Ukrainian soil as permanent guardians. Even Lindsey Graham, one of the most aggressive hawks in Washington, publicly admitted these proposals are far beyond what is politically possible. That alone tells you how unrealistic the document is. But the real purpose of this article is political, not military. It serves two clear objectives. First, it builds Zelensky up as the clean alternative to Zelensky, a man who can allegedly save Ukraine once the current regime becomes too discredited by corruption scandals. With Yermak and others exposed and possibly facing criminal consequences, the Western scriptwriters need a new frontman to keep the money flowing. Second, it manufactures the narrative that corruption has been addressed, and that replacing a few faces allows the West to start the washing machine again, billions in aid cycling through Ukraine and back into Western banks. NGOs, contractors, and political networks. Zelensky himself is no genius commander. He presided over the disastrous 2023 counteroffensive, which failed catastrophically against Russian defenses, cost Ukraine enormous manpower and equipment, and shifted the strategic initiative decisively in Moscow's favor. After that humiliation, he was pushed out and parked in London, where Western media continued to romanticize him as a legendary strategist. The Telegraph piece is simply the latest stage of that myth-making. Even Trump, who now portrays himself as the adult in the room, cannot ignore the rot. On Air Force One, he was asked about Ukraine's corruption and replied bluntly that it is not helpful and that he doesn't like it. He pointed out that this corruption flourished under Biden, not during his own earlier administration, and he clearly understands that the whole arrangement is unsustainable. Washington needs an exit strategy that retains face. Yet the constant exposure of embezzlement, stolen funds, and luxury lifestyles in Kyiv makes it harder to justify sacrificing more money and weapons on a losing proposition. Meanwhile, the European Union has drifted deeper into hysteria and historical revisionism. Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas now repeats a scripted line that Russia has invaded 19 countries in the last 100 years, and therefore every European country is at risk. It is a blatant distortion of history designed to terrify European citizens into accepting rearmament, higher military budgets, and ever more confrontation with Moscow. The line is not new. Ursula von der Leyen and other EU figures have flirted with similar falsifications before, even implying at times that Russia was responsible for nuclear attacks in Japan. A suggestion that collapses under the most basic scrutiny. The goal is not accuracy, but conditioning. The EU political class has openly spoken about preparing for a potential conflict with Russia, sometime around 2027 to 2030. They want to lay the psychological foundation now, creating an atmosphere where the public believes that Russia is inherently aggressive and that another major war is inevitable unless NATO arms itself to the teeth. Marco Rubio's words inadvertently revealed the underlying truth. After his meeting with Umarov, he said there is a second part to the equation for peace in Ukraine, and that part is Russia. Witkoff, he said, would travel to Moscow to speak with this other side as the United States plays neutral mediator. Notice what he did not say. He did not announce that he himself or any top-level American political figure would engage seriously with Russia. Americans are content to send envoys while keeping a public political distance so they can maintain the image of toughness at home without dirtying their hands in direct diplomacy. Yet the fact that even Rubio must acknowledge Russia as an indispensable player shows that despite all their propaganda, the West understands who actually holds the cards. On another front, the so-called dirty war has escalated. There have been attacks targeting the Caspian Pipeline Consortium infrastructure, enraging Kazakhstan, and multiple strikes on commercial tankers that are not even Russian-owned, but happen to be involved in transporting Russian oil or calling at Russian ports. One hit a Chinese-owned Cyprus-registered vessel, Another targeted a ship registered in Gambia. Yet another struck a tanker off West Africa associated with Turkish interests. By hitting these third-party vessels, the perpetrators are not weakening Russia, they are antagonizing key regional players like Turkey, Kazakhstan, and others. It is reckless, short-sighted, and ultimately undermines the West's reputation as a reliable partner. This is a pattern. Instead of changing the underlying strategy, the Western side resorts to escalation in gray zone warfare, hoping to inflict pain indirectly while avoiding open confrontation with Russia. But each such move drives more countries toward neutrality or quiet alignment with Moscow. India offers a perfect contrast. Despite heavy U.S. pressure and constant lecturing about values and sanctions, Indian imports of Russian oil in November reached a 5-month high. New Delhi is doing exactly what any serious state should do, pursuing its national interests rather than subordinating its energy policy to Washington's agenda. The reality is that Russia has found stable, growing markets in Asia, while Europe is crippling itself with energy shortages, deindustrialization, and higher costs, all for the sake of a failing proxy war. Central Europe is also showing cracks. The Polish president refused to hold a bilateral meeting with Viktor Orban simply because the Hungarian prime minister dared to travel to Moscow and speak with Putin about energy and national interests. This behavior from Warsaw is not strength, but insecurity masquerading as moral purity. Orban, for all the criticism he receives, is one of the few European leaders still willing to act like a head of state responsible to his citizens rather than a provincial governor answering to Brussels and Washington. Hungary's stance, keeping open lines with Russia and defending its own energy security, exposes the hollowness of the EU's claim to represent unity. The hypocrisy of U.S. policy becomes even more obvious when you look at Venezuela. Trump has unilaterally declared Venezuelan airspace effectively closed under the pretext of narcotics and narco-terrorism. The narrative is that Washington is heroically targeting drug flows, and that this justifies threats of regime change against Maduro. Yet almost simultaneously, Trump announces his intention to grant a full and complete pardon to former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted in U.S. courts of orchestrating a massive drug trafficking operation, channeling hundreds of tons of cocaine to the United States over 2 decades, allegedly even in connection with El Chapo. The justification for this pardon is that the trial was politically motivated by Biden's administration, but no serious evidence is offered to substantiate that claim. The timing is blatantly awful. On one hand, Trump wants the world to believe that the U.S. is cracking down on a narco-terrorist regime in Venezuela. On the other, he pardons a man legally declared to be at the center of a major narcotics conspiracy. This is not the behavior of a serious anti-drug crusader. It signals that Washington's rhetoric about drugs is a pretext, not a principle. It confirms that when it comes to Venezuela, the issue is geopolitical control and resources, not cocaine. If that were not enough, we have entered outright clown territory on the Western domestic front. The U.S. Secretary of the Department of War posts children-style propaganda on X. Some cartoonish Franklin targets narco-terrorist theme showing a character shooting boats and expects to be taken seriously. This is not the posture of a sober superpower. It is the behavior of a system that has fused politics, marketing, and infantilism into one grotesque spectacle. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni now claims in parliament that she never promised Ukrainian victory, even though there is a long digital record of her making precisely those claims, hugging Zelensky, talking up Kyiv's inevitable success, and urging the public to bet on Ukraine. As the war drags on and the outcome becomes undeniable, Western leaders are already rewriting their own history, denying words they uttered on camera, and distancing themselves from Zelensky as if they barely knew him. All of this points to a simple conclusion that many in the West still refuse to speak aloud. The war in Ukraine will not be decided in Florida conference rooms, Telegraph op-eds, or EU press conferences. It will be decided as it is already being decided by realities on the battlefield and by long-term strategic resilience. On both counts, Russia has the advantage. Moscow holds the initiative, controls critical territory, has the industrial capacity to sustain operations, and maintains a far more coherent political leadership than the fractured, scandal-ridden elites in Kyiv and the West. Ukraine is bleeding men and material, losing territory, and increasingly dependent on Western aid that is no longer guaranteed. Europe is suffering economic damage, political instability, and growing public fatigue. The United States is caught between its global ambitions and its domestic divisions. Russia has been ready to negotiate from the start on the basis of clear, rational conditions, Ukrainian neutrality, recognition of territorial realities, and an end to NATO's eastward expansion and militarization of Russia's borders. These conditions are not extreme. They are the minimum requirements for long-term security in the region. The problem is that the West cannot admit its strategy has failed, nor can it honestly tell its own citizens why it poured hundreds of billions into a war it cannot win. So it clings to illusions, new negotiators, new Ukrainian saviors, new talking points about Russian invasions and looming threats, while the facts march in the opposite direction. In the end, no matter how many theatrical negotiations are staged, no matter how many propaganda articles are published, and no matter how loudly European leaders scream about imaginary Russian invasions of 19 countries, this conflict will conclude when Russia's core conditions are met. Until then, Russia will continue to fight, adapt, and strengthen its position. The West can either accept reality and negotiate seriously or continue its gradual slide into strategic humiliation. Either way, the outcome on the ground is moving one way in Russia's favor.